Okay, so the next class on our stops list, our rails, I guess, our train tracks to success, um, is the Tribemaker, and the most direct, directly allegorical class that we have, I guess, is the Cabaretto right now, to what the Tribemaker wants to do. And also, I hate the name of this class with a burning passion. Couldn't think up anything better at the time. Um, and having gone through this class actually fairly recently on my own, just to look at it, I can tell you that this is probably the most flawed class in the whole of the Ayotls, at least right now. But it's the one that was trying to do the most different sort of implementation at the time, at least. Um, anyway, the reason it's similar to the Cabaretto is because the design question we were trying to answer when we made this class is how do we make a pacifist class? How do we make it seem like you're not doing anything? And this should sound familiar to Logan or probably people who were listening to me when I was working working through the Cabaretto, what it wanted to be doing. But how do we make someone who seems innocuous when they're not really innocuous? Or how do we make a class um, that kind of acts like a monk would? Um, and the answer that we came up with was that you should shroud your abilities from enemies, because then basically it actually looks like you're doing nothing. And we took that idea of shrouding something from your enemies, and we went with it with the Cabaretto, I think, to a much better degree of implementation than the Tribemaker had. Of course, this was our rough draft, which I don't think I ever said, Logan, but now you know. Uh, this is where we were deriving some of those ideas from.
Right.
Uh, there's also going to be something that you guys see here, where we're playing around with the idea of using wisdom in abilities, and it's not going to come across as working very well, I don't think. We had this idea in our heads that there should be a stat that makes casters better attackers than melees, to try and balance out the fact that melee's got a whole bunch of abilities that help them do more damage. And so what we did was we made it so that when you roll for attack with a melee guy, it would be a d10, um, and then you'd add your attack modifier. And the idea for people who used wisdom was that they'd roll a d12 and then they'd add their wisdom modifier if they were attacking with staves or something like that. And wisdom would be a stat that a lot of your abilities scaled off of if you were a mage. And after going through and doing a whole sort of iteration of design with that, we realized that combining classes, which was something that we really wanted to do at the time, we still would like to do, but are choosing not to do for the demo, would be almost impossible. Because if you wanted to combine a melee and a caster and you'd gone through the game as a caster first, and you'd gotten a whole bunch of abilities that scaled off of wisdom, now your abilities that scaled off of attack would be terrible, or just your basic attacks in general would be terrible compared to everyone else at level 10, and vice versa for casters. And so now we're stuck with this stat of wisdom, even in the current iteration. That's this vestigial structure that we do not need. It's an appendix, basically, and I wish it would rupture so that we could replace it with something else. Um, but we're just going to have to find something better. Oh, hey, C2V4, how are you doing? We're we're doing retrospectives on classes right now, so we're going through the Ayotl classes. We're Turtlekin, and we're trying to point out the flaws in those classes, the things that we think we did wrong about 2 years ago when we were designing them, and the things that we think we could do better now, or ways in which we could change the abilities to fit within our current infrastructure a little bit better, or to fit our design philosophy better. Um, and if you have any questions while we're going through, feel free to ask, or comments about how crappy our old design was, or really anything. um, including telling us to stop doing this if it's something you'd rather not see. Though perhaps it'll be interesting. So anyway, long story short, two issues with the implementation of this class. One, we didn't know how to make it so that if you were shrouding all of your abilities, you'd still be able to use abilities on other people. And that was a question that we answered with the Cabaretto. Now we have a pretty good answer for how that would work. The other issue that we ran into was that if we wanted to use wisdom, how would we do it in such a way that it didn't feel statty? Or I guess we weren't really thinking about that then, but now we're thinking about that now. How do we implement wisdom into this class in such a way that it doesn't feel statty? And I don't think there's a way to do that. But then we were thinking, how do we implement wisdom into the class in such a way that it doesn't invalidate a dual build with one of the melees from from this race? Fine, thanks. You motivated me yesterday to start my project, but I'll start it next week. Well, I'm very happy to hear that, C2V4. That project is such a cool one. I mean, really, best of luck to you. I think it's going to be very successful. Um, okay, so the first rank is Primordial Palisade, which is naming wise something I would rather go back and change immediately. Uh, but it's a 10 mana structure. So structures were something that you almost only saw in dwarves and goblins up until this point. But we're introducing it here because we wanted to have a trap. So, target ally is trapped. The structure is invisible until triggered. Choose 3 target enemies. If any of those enemies would attack the chosen ally before the beginning of your next turn, the first to do so receives damage equal to the damage they dealt. If none do, or if the trap triggers, then you may pay an additional 5 mana at the beginning of each of your turns to reset the trap and its invisibility. Primordial Palisade is also consumed if the ally moves between rows. So, basically, before we introduce this passive that shrouds all of your abilities, we wanted to introduce an ability that um, wouldn't show up to the enemies. And I think traps are still an interesting way of doing that. I don't think we have any classes that we've implemented traps on so far, but there might be traps on like the Orcish Slaver or something like that. I'm not convinced that they're very fun to play against yet, and that's the main reason why we haven't been implementing any right now. Because the idea that the opponent can put something invisible on the field that you can't really play around um, is not one that I subscribe to as being a good one, at least at this moment. I want for the enemy to be able to play around things to the best of their capability, to the best of their knowledge. So maybe it's just that we need to find another implementation for traps to make them more interesting for the opponents. And that's another tentative design that I think people who are starting maybe ignore. Abilities need to not just feel fun for the players who are using them, but if you're balancing for PvP, they need to feel fun for the enemies that you're using them against. And games like the original Final Fantasy games, that kind of series, um, and a lot of the RPGs from the early 90s going into the late 90s that weren't designed for playing against other players have a bunch of really cool abilities that would just be horrible to be on the other side of because they're incredibly overpowered once you get leveled up. They have to be because they allow you to grind through. Oh, hey, Shanty. Cute face. Um, they allow you to grind through mobs very, very, very quickly and to get to bosses and actually survive against them. But they don't. If your party were up against a similar party, it just wouldn't feel right. Wouldn't feel as though there were any sort of tactical positioning necessary to win the battle. And so when we design something, we're looking at it from two sides most of the time. How it feels for you and how it feels for them. If it feels too unfair for them, then we change the ability. If it feels not good enough for you, then we change the ability. But let's look at rank 2, which is the crux of the kit of this character. It's called Grand Design, which is another ability I'd like to change the name of. Your abilities are shrouded from enemies and the DM in regular play, so you can see we're still on pen and paper at this point. Whenever you use an ability, mark that action in some way so that your turn actions will be apparent at battle's end. So you had to basically scroll down whatever you were using. That way someone could check a record if they wanted to question you. Mana costs and remaining HP are still revealed. When you are targeted by an enemy, if your wisdom is higher and they do not successfully deal damage, you may remove one instance of a debuff you currently possess that that enemy could afflict you with. Alright, so this is added on because there aren't enough things that Grand Design is interacting with currently. So we felt that it had to have something else. And this is a mistake that you're probably seeing quite frequently at this point. This was our old solution to when abilities didn't come at the right place in the rank order. Basically, if something's coming in at rank 2 and it's not interacting with enough stuff, we were like, well, we don't need to change the order of abilities. We can just tack on a boo boo band aid. And I think in general, that was sort of a sign of laziness, maybe, or maybe just not having an understanding of how to play with the ranks in such a way that they could fit better. We seem to have a better grasp on it now. We know where things should fit. We know how they should fit, and we look at mechanics a bit differently now. Something that I forgot to note, by the way, if we, I don't know if we'd be able to take this and make it a part of the other retrospective, but I'm just going to make a comment on the auger guard that I don't think will carry over to the Tribemaker. So it'll be more about the Tribemaker than it will be about the auger guard, in case there's no way to put this in the auger guard's retrospective. The auger guard, the reason that this class works, or works according to our current design philosophy, is because it has a strong primary mechanic that carries through the entire kit and sort of makes it all work together. The reason that the Tribemaker probably won't work is that it doesn't have a strong primary mechanic that's showing up and structuring the kit. Its primary mechanic is that its abilities are shrouded from enemies. And while that's an interesting sort of gameplay decision that we've made with the kit, and it does influence how the abilities feel to both you and your opponents, or for you and your opponents, it doesn't actually give you anything. It doesn't give you a tangible mechanic. This is more like a secondary or a tertiary level mechanic than a primary mechanic. And I don't know exactly why that is. Maybe one of the other designers can help out here. Why it doesn't feel like primary. I can't word it perfectly. It doesn't feel like a primary mechanic because you're not interacting at least at this point in the kit. You're not interacting with an enemy directly with it, or you're not interacting with it directly in some way. It is interacting with what's already in your toolkit rather than being something for you to interact with. And while that may seem as though it's kind of a semantic difference, it's actually quite important that you are designing something that you're designing a primary mechanic that the player can actually grasp and use. It has to be a hammer. It can't be the tool belt, I guess, if that analogy works. And it may, but it might not. um, hmm. Do you guys have any comment on that?
That was the rank 2, right?
Mm-hmm.
I keep reading it and I'm just like, I don't know what it's doing.
Right. The second part's not important. We could just get rid of that right now. I mean, this ability should just be somewhere else in the kit, and probably when we get back to this class, we'll change the class completely. Like, this one will be completely reworked because it'll feel too close to the Cabaretto, I think.
It's it, your abilities are shrouded from the enemies. Okay, so I'm the Cabaretto.
Right. Yeah, it's hard to work around this one. Hmm. Well, instead of dwelling on it, I will just say that in terms of primary mechanics, this is a pretty weak one, and it's not one that you can design a whole class around because you have to constantly be thinking to yourself, how do we design abilities that work so that our opponent doesn't know that we've casted it, but it's still working? Because if we designed, let's say, a magic missile or something, and they didn't know that we casted it, it's still going to hit someone and deal damage. And when it hits someone and deals damage, then they'll know that we casted it. So anything that has an immediate effect or isn't hidden from the enemy on its own um, is going to show up. And so that's why we use the trap on rank 1, and probably why traps should be a huge part of this kit. But then the class is more like a trapper than it is like a monk, and it's not fulfilling the sort of design ideology that we started with. And I think that's why we decided not to go with that. But I think it would have been the more interesting direction for the class to go in, to be a trapper. Maybe that's what we want when we come back through, is to make it a trapper. I think that would be interesting. Certainly lead to something that no other class has. So, rank 3, Inspiration. I don't know why I called it that, but it certainly isn't an inspiration when it comes to design. Target ally receives an invisible mobility charge. They may proc this charge as an active to move to target adjacent allied row. Um, so basically, you give your ally a mobility charge, and it's invisible, so the enemy doesn't know that they can move. I mean, this is like a rank 1, because you can't even really give it to your. I mean, I guess you could give it to yourself, target ally. It would depend on how we worded it, but it's not good enough to be a rank 3, and it's not even particularly interesting. Um, so I would get rid of this ability. Initiative is rank 4. It's passive. Whenever you cast your second ability in a turn, pay half the cost of the second ability. This is this is a holdover from when we used to think that it was that reducing the casting cost of abilities was cool or interesting for mages. We don't think that anymore. We've realized that whenever you're making something that adjusts the casting cost of an ability um, directly or within a passive, you're basically saying to the player, uh, "We didn't think through the costs of your abilities enough." Or we're artificially raising the cost of your abilities so that this ability is useful and part of your kit. This could be something completely different that's useful to the player and interesting to the player that you're picking up at rank 4. Instead, they're getting it because their abilities cost too much, is the issue. Um, and so, rank 4 should never have been made. It should be thrown into a bottomless pit from whence it could never return, and hopefully barred by multiple gods from different pantheons. And it can stay in Design Tartarus until Kingdom Come. I'll be happy. Right Speak, 10 mana active. Hopefully this one's better. The name's not all that much better. Imbue your attacks with one of the following 2 effects for the duration of the battle. Enemies attacked by you gain an invisible debuff, which triggers and is consumed on the next allied attack against them. That ally deals at least as much damage as you dealt to that enemy. Ouch, that's bad. And the whole concept of this ability isn't very good, but let's keep going. Or the last enemy you attacked gains an invisible debuff, which disables any effects which would trigger at the beginning of their turn. This debuff is consumed when it triggers. So poison stacks that your team put on them would be disabled too. I mean, it's pretty bad. Um, and also, if you had put another type of stack on them, something like the one that you had above, it would disable those too. Um, yeah, I really don't like this ability. It should be a passive, if anything. It's an active that feels like a passive that shouldn't even be an active. This one can also go forever. Uh, I don't know where to, but it should leave. It's like you don't have to go home, but you can't stay here, except for it's a little bit more like you need to leave. Um, so we'll delete those 2 abilities and get rid of them completely. And in fact, we can do that with the rank 3 as well. This will save time when we come back trying to figure out what was bad and what wasn't. Um, these 2 can kind of stay because I think that being a trapper is what this guy's going to want to do. Rank 6, Guidance passive. Whenever you cast an ability, heal target ally for 5 HP. Wow, that's bad. Boom, dead. One of the issues with that ability, the reason why it's so bad, you might think, oh, but healing allies is something that this guy might want to do. I mean, he's a monk, right? It fits within what you guys wanted this class to kind of be like before. Well, it's not so much the issue that there's a healing ability. It's one that the healing total is a flat amount that has nothing to do with any of the abilities that you already have. Two, that it's a healing ability on a class that has no healing until rank 6. So it's a mechanic that we're introducing that ties back in no way to any of the mechanics that you already have. And three, that grand design doesn't interact with it. And grand design is the whole reason that we built the kit. So not only is it not working with the scare quotes again, primary mechanic of grand design, not only is it not working with the rest of the abilities in the kit, but it also is done in an uninteresting way. And for those reasons, if only those reasons, there are also more, it will also be banished forever. And hopefully, when we go back to this retrospective video, if we decide to, before we start working on the Ayotls, there'll be like a big censored sign over these abilities, so I can't actually go back and read through them or connect with them nostalgically in any way. These are like these are like the artwork that you did in kindergarten that your mom would put up on the fridge, except for this one is an especially creepy one where like it's a picture of you having stabbed all of your classmates or something. And so even though it's really cute and it's an heirloom of when you were 5, your mom doesn't quite know whether to put it up on the fridge, so she flips it around backward and puts other things on top of it. And someday, uh, in the future, when you're like 29 or something, you're going through the paintings on the fridge and you eventually get to that one and flip it over, and then a horror movie begins. That's kind of like what the design of those last ones was, at least for me. Fate, 10 mana, choose target enemy. They receive an invisible debuff. Here we go with that invisible debuff thing. If there were a uh, a primary kind of gosh, what's the word? Mechanic. If there were a primary mechanic in this class, it would be invisible debuff. I'll just go ahead and say that now. From the amount of times that it's recurred, even though it's not a very good primary mechanic. You can see that we didn't even care to name it because we didn't realize it at the time. We weren't critical enough to go through and find that this was the primary mechanic. But if we were designing a class now, the first thing that we would put at the top of this, after we'd gone through and thought about it for a while, is invisible triggers or invisible debuffs. And then we would have named that, and you'd see it proliferating out through the kit in at least 5 of the abilities. Choose target enemy, they receive an invisible debuff. If you predict correctly which action they will take first, during their next turn, they are stunned. Okay, so in terms of fairness for the enemy, stunning is a terrible, terrible thing in a turn-based RPG. You spend a lot of time, especially in any kind of turn-based RPG that has you in control of one character and you waiting for all the other characters to take their turns. Because when you can't take a turn after sitting through 4, 5, 6 people taking theirs, you start to get kind of antsy. Like, I want to take my turn. I want to take my turn. Now imagine that you're in a 6v6 match and someone stuns you. You're now waiting through like 11 or more turns for your turn to take place again, which is just terrible. It's not fun for the player. Um, and the fact that you're getting punished for doing something that's not super predictable, but really is kind of a random chance almost, is is a little bit strange. I will say that the reason that this is here is because the Tribemaker is supposed to sort of be this monk who, or this monk-like person who controls a tribe and can see the actions that the other tribe are going to take against them, not through any sort of future sight that they possess, but more through planning and tactics. That this is supposed to be a part of that, but doesn't do a good job of communicating that, I don't think, at all. So we'll get rid of that. Ambition passive upgrades initiative whenever you cast your second ability. Okay, this is terrible. Goodbye. I didn't think it would recur at some other point in the kit. That would be an idea that we thought was good enough to have happen twice. But I think that the reason it does is because we didn't have any other ideas. We were like, what can we do? Well, we should upgrade something because we're running out of ideas. We don't have anything else. which is not what you should do if you're designing something. If you don't have ideas, you should figure out why you don't have ideas. Is it because the primary mechanic isn't obvious enough, or isn't obvious enough to the designers, not necessarily to the players? You can create a primary mechanic that's obvious to you, but is subtle for the player. Um, I think in general we just didn't study enough of what the class wanted to be doing before we went into it and started trying to design it. We didn't take enough time with it. Uh, and so that shows. I mean, just looking at this giant blank spot in the middle of the kit after these two abilities, which kind of form a kit in and of themselves, but nothing else has so far. Uh, that should serve as evidence. Prosperity, 5 mana active. Target enemy receives an invisible debuff, so there we go, there's our primary mechanic. This debuff triggers and is consumed the next time they receive a buff. Okay, so now it's contingent upon them receiving a buff, which they might not get if their team doesn't have any buffers whatsoever, and it's tied to rank 9. So this is already a poor ability. Allies on target row receive the same buff. Okay, this is sort of interesting. The issue is that it's not going to come about quite as frequently as you would hope. It's way too situational. For as long as the debuff remains on the chosen enemy, you may reveal it. If you reveal the debuff, you may cast this ability again for 5 additional mana as a free active. So the idea was that you would proliferate out this debuff across all of the enemies, and whenever they received a buff, your team would receive a buff. I think that idea is interesting. I don't think there's any way to implement it within a PvP context in an interesting way. Unless, of course, you're giving buffs to the enemy. Then that's a whole other class idea. Like, that's a class concept, basically, that you give buffs to the enemy team that actually work as debuffs, and then your team gets those debuffs, or buffs, whatever you're giving to the enemy team, and it boosts them. So, um, I don't know exactly how you'd make that class, but that's something maybe I'm interested in making for some other race somewhere. Um, and that's okay. If we want to look at this as a lesson, sometimes you can have a pretty bad idea that sometimes you can have a really poor implementation of a pretty good idea. And as long as you're willing to look through and make sure that it's there and maybe save it, you can use it again somewhere else, recycle it. Um, the reason that we deleted all of those other things is that they are abjectly, gruesomely bad. This one, it's not so clear that it's bad, it's just poorly done. So I'm going to delete this, but I'm going to try and remember that that's a class concept that we'd like to include somewhere. Okay, all mother, all father. The issue with this one is I couldn't find a gender neutral term to put behind all, so I chose to go with a double name, which we never do, and I would like to never do again. In fact, I'll probably delete this after I see it, whatever it is. At the beginning of battle, choose between the all mother or all father mode of this ability. All mother. Whenever you cast the first ability of your turn, you may recast it if it is negated or redirected. So, in order for this passive side to be good, let's just assume that it's a good design, which it's not, but let's assume that it is. In order for this to work, they have to have someone on their team who can negate or redirect your abilities. So you will never ever pick All Mother unless that's the case. So let's look at All Father. Whenever you cast the second ability of your turn, you may have all allies receive 5 HP and mana. So this is yet another ability that is giving you healing that's not attached to the kit at all. And it's the one that you're going to pick almost 100% of the time, because All Mother's only good in situations like the one I described, where they have someone who can redirect, or a whole team that's based around redirecting. Even then, it's not particularly good. So we'll get rid of that. So what do we have left after going through the Tribemaker? Grand Design and Primordial Palisade. Of those two abilities, I don't think either of them pass a 6 on the implementation scale. I think they're actually probably stuck around a 4. But in terms of ideas, Grand Design went on to become the Cabaretto, more or less. That idea served as the inspiration for it, even though we weren't directly acknowledging it at the time. And Primordial Palisade brought in the idea of traps, and I think that traps are interesting enough to base a whole class around. So the Tribemaker will probably become a trap class.